is 7 on the dot. I'm going to go ahead and get this started. Good evening and welcome to Bethel College for this forum, What's Happening at the State House and How It Affects You, a discussion with journalists from the Kansas Reflector. We're excited that you are here with us this evening. We have folks here in person. We also have folks who are joining us with the live stream. We're so happy to be able to offer this service through the Bethel College YouTube channel. I'm Christine Kraus-Dick. I'm professor and chair of the Communication Arts Department here at Bethel College, and I'm excited that we get to co-sponsor this event with Harvey County Now. All of our publicity about this event indicated that it would be moderated by Adam Strunk, journalist and director of editorial content with Kansas Publishing Ventures. Unfortunately, Adam is unable to be with us this evening, but we are in excellent hands with Lindsay Young, who is a Bethel College Communication Arts Department alumnus and also co-owner, co-publisher, copy editor, and columnist of Harvey County Now. So please help me welcome Lindsay Young to the podium as she facilitates and moderates our time together this evening.
I'm glad I sucked up to Christine as much as I did in the back in the day. So we are so excited to have the part of the staff from the Kansas Reflector with us today. If you're not familiar with the Reflector, I completely stole their bio, their about us off their website, and I figured I would just tell you a little bit about them. So the Kansas Reflector is a nonprofit news operation. They really don't do those deep dive type reporting, so no surface level from the Reflector. They also have a really strong opinion section as well, and they really try to focus on how making people aware of how decisions are being made at the State House and trying to get more participation from us as Kansans in our democracy. It was launched in July of 2020, and it's an affiliate of the State's Newsroom, which is a national 501c3 nonprofit that's supported by grants. You can also help support the Kansas Reflector. You can do that by going to kansasreflector.com, and we'll talk more about that later on as well. But I want to start with having our esteemed guests just give us kind of a brief introduction of themselves and kind of just tell us who you are.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm Sherman Smith. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Kansas Reflector. Launched this in 2020, right in the middle of a pandemic and an election year, so a good runway for launching a news service. I spent 16 years at the Topeka Capital Journal before doing that. I grew up in Lyon County, went to Emporia State University. Started on the copy desk, did a bunch of different things before going over to the State House in 2018, where Tim had been for many, many years. So we worked together there covering state government for a while before launching this, and I was able to convince him to come with me and help launch this crazy endeavor.
My name is Tim Carpenter. I grew up on a dairy and beef cattle farm in Missouri. Went to K-State and got an ag degree, and instead of flunking out of school, I got an ag journalism degree and became a journalist. And I've been a reporter for about 35 years in Kansas, and I've covered the day-to-day legislative sessions since 2005. But the first time I went to the Capitol was as a student reporter at K-State, and I watched the State of the State speech by John Carlin, if anybody remembers that guy. So it's quite a while ago. I like being at the Reflector, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you. We've been able to go to a few meetings like this, and we wanted to do it when we started, but as you recall, COVID suggested that we didn't have mass gatherings anywhere. It'd be a bad idea. And so we're finally getting to it, and I look forward to your questions tonight.
And hello, okay. Well, it's going to be a learning experience. Anyway, my name's Clay Wirestone. I'm the opinion editor. I am delighted to be here, delighted to see all of you. Hello, Newton. Hello, North Newton. Woo! Yes. So I have been a journalist for about, I guess, 15, 16 years at this point, with a detour into nonprofit communications. I worked in child advocacy About from 2017 to 2021, I thought I was done with the journalism field. And then Sherman enticed me back with the Reflector. It is I am in absolute awe and admiration of what Sherman has built. When the opinion editor position came open at the Reflector, I really wanted to be a part of it. I am, born and raised in Kansas from Wichita area. I grew up, went to middle school and high school in El Dorado, went to KU, and then I worked in Florida for a few years and then spent 11 years in New Hampshire at the Concord Monitor up there doing presidential primaries and all of the fun stuff there. But still have family and friend connections in Kansas, and came back to the Topeka Capital Journal, where both Sherman and Tim were at the time in 2016, and that's where at least I got to know these guys, and I'm so glad to be able to work with them again, and glad to be here with you.
All right. So we have a few questions that the audience has already given us. If you have a question, Joey over here, the good-looking one with the matching shirt to me, he's got some slips of paper and pens. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, just kind of wave him down and he can bring you something so you can submit some more here. Several of the questions that we had are I want to start with kind of just the journalism side of it. So the first question I want to ask you guys that someone had was, who owns the Reflector? So not just the company or the name of an owner, who owns it?
Yeah, so our parent organization is States Newsroom. The person at the top of that chain is Chris Fitzsimon. He kind of had this vision a while back in North Carolina, started a nonprofit news organization there, and then launched the States Newsroom with the idea of kind of replicating that, I think, in other states. And so their idea was to put bodies back into state houses where the ranks of journalists have been depleted through the years. We were, I think, number 12 or 13 to come online, something like that. We're up to 33 now. I think we'll be in 40 in another year. They provide the bulk of our funding, enough funding for us to exist, I would say, and then we depend on funding from our readers and donors in Kansas to augment that, so that, we can have a camera, we can file open records requests, we'll have an internship this summer that's full-time and paid. We can travel around the states, not just to town halls like this, but to also do reporting projects in areas that are not being well covered or just don't have a thriving newspaper anywhere within hundreds of miles sometimes. We exist in editorial autonomy, so it's really just us making the decisions. Nobody tells us what to write or how to write it or when to write it. We make those decisions alone. They do operate a DC bureau, so we have access to those stories we can include on our website. And we collaborate sometimes with the other affiliates. In addition to the three of us here, we have reporter Rachel Mepro, who's with us in the State House every day. She came up from Louisiana last year. Her parents are visiting, so she couldn't be here tonight. We let her have a couple of days off for that. We have also Allison Kite is a reporter we share with our Missouri affiliate. She was also with us for a while at the Topeka Capital Journal, and she covers the environmental stuff. So that's our primary focus for both us and Missouri. So that's kind of the team and how it works.
I would also just note really quickly that if you go to statesnewsroom.com, I believe, you'll hear feedback. No, but there is actually a page there that includes a list of all of the donors who have given the States Newsroom organization more than $500 since its founding. So that's there, as well as its tax returns, which is a nonprofit. Those are public information.
Right. Just to dispel a myth, we have not received any funding from George Soros, but if you have his number, please put in a good word for us.
All right, I have a couple that are kind of similar here. So there's all kinds of deep fakes, and then you have different news organizations that are focused maybe more in that opinion realm. How do you guys fact check to make sure that you are getting the accurate information out there?
So From a reporter's perspective, the editorial side of it is distinct from the three reporters that write news stories. So Clay is going to write his editorials. He doesn't consult with me about what he writes, how he writes, when he writes it. Sherman and I would write news stories independently of the editorial page, just exactly like it functioned at the Lawrence Journal-World and the Topeka Capital Journal where I worked before, is that there was a pretty significant firewall between the newsroom and the editorial people. I didn't want them messing with my work, and I didn't mess with them. So that is a distinction. Fact-checking, well, in the Capitol building, I would assume that every day that I'm there that someone is lying to me. So sometimes, your first instinct is to not publish lies. And I don't really like that word. The first politician to use it was Sam Brownback regularly when he was running against Paul Davis. And I refused to put those quotes in the story, and now I regret it. It was a mistake I made. I should have put it in there. But the lies, you try to use your experience and documentation and talking to others to try to sort through the opinions of others. But sometimes those opinions are just the opinions, and you need to put that information on the record as well. But I think if somebody's just making an assertion that the earth is flat, you're not going to put that into a story. So sometimes the opinions of others are their opinions, and they have standing. They could be a Senate president, and they say that public education is terrible, all of it's terrible. That's their view, and I'll put that in a story and go find some other people who perhaps think differently and include that as well.
I would say one of the things that we've tried to do in our reporting in those situations is what we refer to as a truth sandwich, where we can say, here's what the facts really are, then here's the insane quote about how fentanyl is coming across the border, then we can come back and explain that fentanyl is actually coming in through ports of entry and mail and other ways of getting into the country. So it's important, I think, as Tim said, to document things that are not true, that people in powerful positions are saying, but then we also have to surround that with the real information.
So I have another question is, does the legislature, or then their leadership, do they treat you differently than some maybe more conservative publications?
Well, I don't know that there's really a conservative publication. Every now and then when Fox News parachutes into the state, they're kind of fawned over, but that's very rare. I think it just depends from one lawmaker to the other how they view us. Some people hate us. Some people, I think, understand that we're about the only outlet that gets news into all the different corners of the state of Kansas, and if they want to have a voice in this conversation, they have to talk to us.
So I've run into many legislators that didn't like our coverage. When I asked them for details about what the objection was, they had none. And they couldn't identify it was incorrect, for example. What they really are asking, what they're really saying is, give us coverage that's biased to my perspective, to that individual's perspective. And that could come from the right and the left and the middle. People want coverage and want to be their ideas presented in a favorable light by a journalist, and that's just not always possible. So I've sat in governors' offices before and have them complain about what I was doing, and sometimes it's just about ideology. Had governors try to get me fired before. So, and I'm still here. So, I think, anything you want to add?
I mean, I would just add that it's really important to say, even from the opinion side, I clearly have more of a liberal progressive view personally, and as the opinion editor, as someone who writes opinion columns, like that shows up, that's my job. But I make a real point because there are sometimes people who are Democrats or Democratic operatives in the State House, they come on, they're like, oh, hey, we're on the same team. Let me give you this or let me give you that. And the fact is, I'm not on their team. Like, I have the things that I believe. I have my perspectives. But I'm not on a team to make Laura Kelly successful. I'm not on a team to make the Democrats in the legislature successful any more than I am to make the Republicans successful. And I mean, I feel very very strongly about that from the opinion side as well.
So how is the Reflector, how would you say that it is different from like other existing news services? So like the Kansas News Service, how is what you guys do different?
Well, I don't want to compare us directly to another service because I think that everybody kind of has their own ideas about approaching news, and I think it's healthy that we all do things a little bit differently because it makes it better for the the people of Kansas. If you see three people covering things in a different way, it gives you a different understanding of these issues. But one of the things that I try to be cognizant of is who our audience is, or who I want our audience to be, which is the people in this room, the people all across the state of Kansas who maybe aren't obsessed with what's going on in politics or government, but if we can find a way to make these issues relevant to you in your daily lives. So I think there are certain reporters who perhaps are writing to an audience. It seems like they're writing to an audience of people who are in the State House, of lawmakers and lobbyists and activists and agency people. And we don't write any of the jargony stuff, the hallway gossip kind of things, because as I tell our reporters, we're writing to the grungy populace. Right? You guys are our audience, not them.
I mean, I would also say in terms of what makes us different, certainly on the opinion side, it's that we have an opinion side. At this point in the entire state of Kansas, as far as I can tell, there are only two people whose full-time job is working on opinion in terms of writing columns and editing submissions. And that would be me and Dion Leffler, who's at the Wichita Eagle. There's literally no one else. And it used to be that a bunch of smaller papers like the Hutch News or Salina Journal or whatever, they would all have their Garden City, they'd have their own opinion editor who would be in that community and who would be doing that kind of thing on a much more person-to-person basis. And so I just think it's really important to have someone, anyone, to have someone out there who's willing to, edit and collate and put out opinion coverage.
If I could just take 60 seconds and help you with the landscape. 20 years ago, the Kansas City Star might send 4 or 5 reporters to the legislative session every year. The Wichita Eagle would have their own staff, 2 or 3 people. The Associated Press had 3 full-time reporters year-round. Capital Journal would have a couple people there. There was TV people. There was Harris News Service. You might be familiar with that. So Sarah Kessinger and some of her crew would be there writing specifically for the papers in western part of the state. Oh, well, okay, Harris is gone. AP has 1 reporter in the Capitol. The McClatchy papers, which are the Kansas City Star and the Wichita Eagle, have 1 reporter there, and it used to be one of our interns at the Capital Journal. He used to be a KU student. Public radio is diminished. There is the Kansas News Service. There are people at the Kansas City Star that can parachute in, all of which are our friends and we've worked with. The having 3 reporters in the State House is a big add. There's a couple one-person shops that are online and for fee purposes, but I've always viewed, and some of them felt threatened by us, like really threatened, because our content is free. There is no ads. Other publications can run it in, online or in print for free, and so this was considered a threat by some people, but none of those entities have gone out of business. There's more stories in the Capitol floating around than any of us can get to. And so I've always been a huge supporter of having more reporters, not less. And, we're just desperate to have eyeballs on these people, because, they do nefarious things when we're standing around. If we weren't there, any guesses what they would do? They just send money right to their own personal addresses, through their employee. I mean, it would be outlandish, and you would regret not having a newspaper subscription at that point. But it also might be too late. So it's really important for us to be there and keep eyes on these folks and just try to document what they're doing, for better or worse. And I hope there's somehow more reporters that come along, but for right now, we're kind of hanging on by our fingertips and doing what we can. I tell people my job description is I go to some boring meetings so you guys don't have to.
All right. Well, that actually leads me into kind of my last talking shop question here. And some folks are kind of wondering, how do they get a hold of your stuff? Do you have a print edition? Also, do you do fundraisers? And somebody wants to know what you think your long-term chances of survival are.
Always low. No. Not
I
really.
think we have a secure long-term commitment from State's newsroom to be able to continue doing this, so I don't have to worry about that. I look at some of the other startups around the states, nonprofits especially, who have tried to do this, and it just kind of feels like we're cheating because we don't have to go out and convince people to give us money every day so that we can come back to work tomorrow. I send out a newsletter request about 3 times a year asking for people to support what we do. Do that around the time of our anniversary and try to point out some of the big stories that we've been able to write in the past year. We do this around Giving Tuesday, I think it is, in December, and then try to find a time in the spring. So recently we had an issue with it was Emporia State University. They didn't want to give us records that should be very easy to turn over. Told us it would cost $700, so I posed that to our readers, and within 4 hours we had $7,000 and more coming in, later. So,
We can antagonize Emporia State for quite a while.
yeah, right. And everybody else out there that's trying to withhold records. There's a front part of that question. Oh, how to get our stuff. You can go to kansasreflector.com. It's a website, as Tim said, everything is free to read with no advertising. We're on social media, Facebook, Twitter. Tim is actually a TikTok star. You may not know it to look at him, but we've been told that there's no dancing on campus, so he can't demonstrate his TikTok dance. And of course, we let everybody republish us for free, so you might see us in local newspapers around the
We
state.
also have a daily newsletter.
That's right, free daily newsletter. There's a sign-up sheet somewhere through email.
Yes.
I'm not sure where that went, but if you put your name and email address on there, we'll add you to it. That just is like a list of all the headlines we've published in the past 24 hours and a little summary of each story. Yeah, we don't do anything in print.
Ourselves.
They are featured regularly on the pages of Harvey County Now, especially if it's something that is more locally focused for us too, just as a shameless
Yes,
plug.
a round of applause for Harvey County Now.
All right, so let's get into some dirt here. So I've got several people that want to talk about public education and vouchers and private schools. What is happening with all of that? What can we expect to see with public education going forward, especially with vouchers on the horizon, perhaps?
The Senate and House negotiators are trying to work out whatever the big grand compromise is going to be on this right now. I think they met for 3 minutes and 50 seconds or something yesterday morning before deciding to come back on Monday. Right now there's all sorts of things stuck in this bill, but a lot of it does deal with this voucher program. That's a sticking point that the House really wants. To me, it looks like when you look at the fiscal note with this, it's like a big cash giveaway to people who are already in private schools, and then some incentive then to take your kids out of public schools and put them into private schools. And all this money is coming out of the public school system. So it's certainly a threat to public schools. It's how public schools and educators view it. Who knows what this final product is going to be? The governor would surely veto it if it isn't there. But there's still a lot of work left to do on that.
I mean, I would point out too that one of the things about public education that's a continual thorn in the side of legislators is that it is in our Constitution to fund an adequate, right?
Yeah.
Public education.
Adequate and equitable.
Right. So in essence, even if they did fund a voucher program, there would still be that constitutional pressure on legislators to make public schools whole in one way or another. But exactly how that would play out would be uncertain.
It looks like part of the play here is to leverage the special ed funding, which the state has underfunded for some time. This has been something that the governor has identified as one of her key priorities. So I think the idea is to try to leverage what she wants for something that they want. who knows what that'll look like, but trading special ed funding for vouchers seems like a big ask.
All right, so what about Medicaid expansion? Where are we there?
So it's just a story that I just keep writing over and over and over again. And, the House has passed a Medicaid expansion bill in the past, and Brownback didn't like it. And so he kept coming up with a long series of reasons why Kansas shouldn't do it. I've lost track of how many billions of dollars Kansas has left on the table because they're among, less than 10 states that haven't expanded. And it's really, it's Kansas, a few other states, and the South that say no. And I think North Carolina they're going to do it. So it's too much money for the healthcare system, too much money for local hospitals to absorb uncompensated care. It's denying people preventive health care. And the expansion question is about the working poor and whether or not those people should have some kind of quality health care so they can go to work and have a job and take care of their families. So Governor Kelly has advocated it since the day she was a senator and continues. She's come up the past 4 years with 4 different ideas. Like, I think one of them was, let's have medical marijuana and use that tax revenue to pay for Medicaid expansion. And the legislature, at least the leadership, is completely and wholly invested in stopping it. So I think if you let a wide open, single issue bill onto the House floor and the Senate floor, Medicaid expansion, it would pass. But the leadership have different ideas. It's a political weapon, and I just wonder sometimes about questions that people have to answer when they meet their maker. And the people that say no to Medicaid expansion are going to have to struggle with the answer.
So I would point out that I'm the opinion editor.
All right, this gets to another question about our own personal biases. I have my own views. The real trick is to be disciplined enough not to embed all of that stuff in your news stories. And it's taken a lot of years, and I'm old enough now. I'm 61 years old, and I'm old enough now that a lot of these issues I've gone past. And so I don't have to worry about too many of them anymore. My one big play to influence public policy, I was walking up a street in Topeka with Governor Brownback. And I said, Governor, I'm going to be one of your constituents here for the next 5 minutes. And I went to K-State. I paid for my college education myself. My parents were very poor. And it took a number of years to pay off that debt. But I cherish it. And I told him, I think your tuition increases at state universities are going up too rapidly, and you're going to price people out of a college education. Me. I couldn't have gone to college here if under these circumstances. And this is my big push. I'm going to inject myself into the public policy arena. And he shrugged his shoulders and said, those tuition rates aren't too high. And that was it.
I would also point out in terms of the Medicaid expansion question, which this is just something I realized the other week, because of the national COVID-19 emergency that went into place a couple of years ago, there's been something called a continuous coverage provision for people who've been enrolled in Medicaid in Kansas, which essentially means that they don't do like extra eligibility determinations after someone is enrolled. And essentially, the Kansas Health Institute figured out that that continuous coverage provision, because of the emergency declaration, has covered around 132,000 Kansans. And if you actually look at what Medicaid expansion would cover, the estimate is 150,000 Kansans. So in essence, when people say all these doom and gloom stories about what it would mean to have expanded Medicaid in Kansas, we've had it for the last 2 years. And essentially no one noticed.
So Tuesday night, late Tuesday night, at the end of like a 16-hour all-day debate-a-thon, I think Democrats thought they had a clever way of addressing this issue. There was a bill that dealt with basically making it harder for people in their 50s to get access to food stamps. But it dealt with a section of state law that many years ago under Brownback, they inserted a line in there that says the governor cannot do Medicaid expansion without the legislature's approval. So Democrats realized we could amend this bill by simply striking these lines from this bill. All it did was delete one sentence from it. And by doing that, it would have given the governor the authority to unilaterally launch a Medicaid expansion plan. This was then ruled not germane on the House floor, which means usually if you propose an amendment to a bill, it has to be the same subject as the bill. And the Rules Chair came back and said, yeah, well, we just don't think these two things are related. Democrats were furious because it's just, all we're doing is deleting a sentence from here. But if you have the votes and it's what the leadership wants, you just say, the rules are what we say they are.
So we're talking about funding. So the other big elephant in the room right now is flat tax. Where is this going and what do we think of it?
Why don't we leave this to Clay?
Oh boy, thanks guys. So it's kind of a mystery, I've got to say. So essentially, we've seen this session, even going in at the beginning of the session, there was a real drive by some of the usual suspects, the Kansas Chamber, some of the big money lobbies that, you know, have definite policy asks each year. And there was a real interest in trying to get a flat tax. Right now, Kansas has a 3-tiered income tax system, although the rate differences are fairly minimal. I think it's like 6.5, 4, and 3.5, something like that. And so the desire was to get it all at one rate. And, you know, Democrats weren't a fan, a fair number of Republicans weren't fans. It seemed like the bad old days of Brownback again. But then just literally within the last 2 or 3 days, there have been a number of kind of deals made over in the House where they didn't just insert a flat tax, but they also increased a property tax exemption for property values up to $80,000, I think it was, so that would be exempt from property taxes. They passed they added the acceleration of the food sales tax elimination so that would be taken out this year. And in adding essentially these extra goodies to the flat tax bill, they managed to pick up a lot of Democratic votes over in the House. Now, this is already passed over in the Senate without all the goodies. They just passed it as a flat tax. So at some point now, those two bills are going to meet, and you know that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, and we see what happens. I think if they manage to keep all of the treats in there that the Democrats like, I actually think that you could see a bill come out that the governor would sign because it gets some of what she wants. She wants that food tax gone. It gets some property tax relief, and you know the flat tax. I mean, it's not. I mean, it would be one thing if we had a top rate that was like 20% and a middle rate that was 15 or whatever. I mean, we're talking about a fairly subtle gradient now, anyway. So she might just decide to do it.
To some degree, Governor Kelly plays defense on this, and so there's a lot of crazy tax ideas in the State House. You know, the legislature hates the federal government to tell Kansas what to do, but the legislature loves telling cities and counties exactly where they should get off. And so there's some wicked tax legislation in there that would restrain local government. And so maybe to a degree, Governor Kelly could agree to a flat tax, get rid of the rest of the food sales tax, and some other measures that soften the blow and really avoid some catastrophic tax policy. I think the bottom line for her is the bottom line, and there's going to be a number there of tax forgiveness that she probably won't cross, and which is kind of, if you go way back to 2012, that's what happened to Brownback. They drove off $1 billion cliff with a huge income tax cut, and they never moderated spending to bring it in line. So maybe the policy was a good idea, who knows? But it was never going to work because they didn't have the gumption to cut spending. And so eventually they just destroyed the budget for 5 years until the Republicans got together and basically repealed a bunch of the Brownback tax era program. He vetoed the bill and they overrode his veto. They drove right over his back. And so, you know, Laura Kelly is working with the realities of a supermajority in the House and Senate, that they have the partisan people to override her vetoes. And so, you know, she's going to veto a bunch of legislation this year. And I think it's not a comfortable feeling to lose those veto override votes, so she would want to minimize that. So making a deal on taxes would be one way to avoid a lot of that conflict.
And it's looking like the bill as it stands right now would be about $1 billion hit, probably per year. We're saying?
Right. Yeah, maybe more.
So one of the big issues here not too long ago was the abortion amendment. And, Kansans overwhelmingly voted against that. So why are the legislators still debating abortion restrictions? And if people are overwhelmingly against these restrictions, why are these types of legislators still getting elected?
I was talking to Sherman for the last part of that. Why are people still getting elected?
Mm-hmm.
Because the people back home are electing exactly who they want to go to the State House. I used to look at some legislators who just looked like buffoons, and I didn't understand it, but lo and behold, they're beloved at home. They're the music teacher for 30 years at Lacine High School. Everybody loves him. They got no idea what their guy is doing in Topeka, but they love him. So abortion, right? I sat there on that August night and thought the abortion amendment would pass, and boy, how wrong I was. So I didn't understand just quite the ferocious response among Kansas youth and others, how well funded that campaign was, how good their strategy was to reach out to different sectors of the Kansas electorate. Why are anti-abortion lobbyists still on the hunt in Topeka? Because they'll never give up. And this is their thing. This is their single issue that they focus on. And they work very hard to trim the edges of abortion rights. And their big challenge right now is the Kansas Supreme Court a couple years ago just hunted around in the State Constitution Bill of Rights and found a right to abortion in there. Right to bodily autonomy, which means right to abortion. And that's a tough, bitter pill for them to swallow. And so what they do is work around the edges. I think when you ask this specific question to legislators, like what's going on here? Why do we have 10 different anti-abortion bills? They'll tell you that the Kansas voters, who they tell everybody we should listen to, just got it wrong. They were confused. I've been told many times they were just simply confused about the amendment. The amendment the anti-abortion people wrote. They wrote the amendment, every word of it, and if you couldn't understand it, it's their fault. It's like in 2007, there had been 10 years of lobbying to have casino gambling. And we're sitting there and there's a big filibuster on the Senate floor. They're trying to get the 21st vote and they're reading from instructions on how to play blackjack, and it's really weird. And eventually they got the 21st vote. We got casino gambling, and there was a whooshing sound out in the rotunda, and that was the lobbyist. All the 15 to 20 lobbyists who'd made a ton of money off casino lobbying just lost all their income. So I understand the ideological agenda of people that are for and against abortion, but make no mistake, there's big money involved in that. Big money. And, the election last year was, I don't know, the amendment alone, 15 million, 20 million. It's astonishing. And so there's tons of cash spent every year in the Capitol on this as well. And these organizations that have a vested interest in this just generate tons of donations off of it.
Yeah, I would say too, the August 2nd amendment was the rare opportunity to say you're voting on a singular issue and nothing else. And I think when you go to choose between two candidates, you have a lot of things on your mind about why you're voting for a particular person. And it's easy for a lot of things to influence that vote. The amendment was, do you want abortion to be banned in Kansas or not? And I think that was a clear and decisive message. We had a couple of cases before the Supreme Court earlier this week that Tim and I wrote about, and I had an opportunity to ask some questions to the guy for the Attorney General's office who's arguing the case on behalf of the state with the other reporters, and we were pressing him on this issue, and he said, okay, so I'll concede that what voters told us in August was they don't want us to ban abortion, but it's still not clear whether they want us to regulate it. We think we should be able to regulate abortion in any number of ways. And so I think that's where we're seeing the kind of the talking point pivot to.
All right, well, another question that I think will maybe land in that same lobbying camp. What do you think is going to happen with the natural gas industry and energy brokers? Is anybody at the state going to do anything to stop price gouging?
Nope. So I think somebody can figure out where all that money went, you know? We're paying Westar and these other utilities every penny that they lost in that weird natural gas spike, right? We're paying for it for like 5-10 years. We're gonna pay extra. The KCC says they don't have any jurisdiction. And the Attorney General, who's happened to be at that time running a campaign for governor, didn't necessarily want to anger utility companies or anybody else. So the investigation of what was going on, I think Attorney General Derek Schmidt hired a reputable law firm, to dig into it. And I heard the other day that Chris Kobach fired the law firm. So I don't know if he wants to hire his own people, doesn't want the investigation to go any further, but don't expect to get any money back from whoever took all those hundreds of millions of dollars while people were sitting in their houses being cold. So.
Happy day, everybody.
I thought this was going to be an uplifting State House
Oh,
talk.
no.
We'll get to that.
So I actually have some questions about some things that are a little more local that I also know that you guys have talked about on your pages as well. So we have the local group Beneficient that is benefiting from the TEFI legislation that went through, and you guys have done some extensive reporting on that. You might give us maybe a little, summary about what that is for those of us that maybe aren't as aware, and then, have we figured out how these people make their money and what their intentions are in our area?
Yes, I don't think we've even figured out what a TEFI is. If you track the court documents and you look at some of the concerns that are now coming through from, becoming more and more clear from legislators, banking commissioner, a lot of stuff that we've kind of hinted at around the edges over the past year. There's this company that basically made off with a bunch of money by selling junk bonds that were never going to be paid off. They took that money and shoved it into a company in Kansas and said, let's call it a TEFI. We'll get the lawmakers to give us a charter by putting a lot of money into campaign accounts. We'll sell this idea that mom needs a grocery store in downtown Heston because it's way too far to drive to Newton to get groceries. And this will be like, credit cards were to South Dakota and LLCs were to Delaware. It'll be the next big thing. Everybody will invest in it. Of course, everybody took one look and said, this seems like a joke. Nobody knows how it works. Nobody can figure out the business model. The company can't provide audited financial statements. But the legislature continues to go along with it. I think at this point, Democrats and Republicans are both into it so deep that they can't escape with any kind of, there's no easy way of saying, I couldn't see this coming. I made a terrible mistake. What did I do? So I think everybody's just kind of hoping it goes away. But, lawsuits keep circling, creditors keep circling, and it's going to come to a head at some point.
I would also circle back to the question you asked earlier about what makes the Reflector different or what makes us special. And I think one of the prime things is the ability to take a story like that. I mean, and I saw Sherman work on this, and he was dogged and worked on it a long time. And the ability to take that kind of time and to, put all of that effort into that story when, there's no guarantee that like anybody, reads a huge amount of that or gives us a bunch of money for it or anything. I mean, he's doing it because it's something that's interesting, because it's something that he thinks matters. And I think that's, really special.
TEFIs are not particularly good for page views.
We want to be careful because, these people are tough customers, and they scrutinize our stories closely. They complain about singular words in a headline. They're very, very defensive. And if you stand there and talk to the banking commissioner, he's just got red alarm bells going off in his head relentlessly. The Teffy people they cut the knees off of the banking commissioner in terms of this business enterprise. They got essentially a banking charter, which they advertise out there to investors that they have a charter as if they're sanctioned by the state of Kansas and are sweet and pure. And the bankruptcy filings are ghastly. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So I'm not speaking specifically of Teffy, but if you go north of Lawrence, north of Topeka area, there was this idea that they could, what's the electronic money? They want to put it in a server thing. Cryptocurrency. Right, so the idea was to go into this McLouth, this little town, bulldoze the local government, go half a mile north of town, set up these metal trailers that were going to have computer servers in it, have essentially 8 engines the size of 8 locomotives sitting there powering this system because they need a bunch of air conditioning to keep them cool. And they were going to draw natural gas out of semi-plugged wells, like right there. And they said they were going to put up these curtains on the fence and plant some bushes, and the people in town wouldn't hear any noise out there. I mean, it's just, they're bullying little towns that maybe are hungry for economic development, but they're going to totally destroy the quality of life there if this thing goes through. So there was such a blowback, and the blue bloods in McLouth and the farms around there said, hey, wait a minute. And so the county commission put a 1-year moratorium on just considering those permits. I think sometimes big slick guys from Dallas, Texas come into little towns in Kansas and elsewhere, and they have these grandiose ideas about how everybody can get rich together. And I think it's kind of phony baloney. But I guess, the legislature bid on it. They passed the laws. They have the charter. And, I'll be retired by then, and all the legislators that voted on it are gone. But in 10, 12, 15 years, we'll find out whether it's a great success or a catastrophe. So good luck with all of that, Heston.
I think the real selling point on here was the promise of rural development, right? They were going to siphon a couple of percentage points off of all of these deals in the Teffy to fund rural development. And I think that was supposed to go to a local nonprofit, which is a nonprofit that the company set up for itself. And the latest bill going through the State House this year would be to allow that nonprofit to become the kind of nonprofit that can spend money on elections.
Political campaign expenditures. Wow. I mean, what more do you need to get a little scared about all this, You got a good question over there?
So one of our local senators, Carolyn McGinn, she has a bill that she's been trying to get through on limiting the lengths of trains. And this is something that is very near and dear to our hearts here in Newton and North Newton. So can you maybe talk a little bit about, does that even have a chance? And especially with all of the now increasing concerns with derailments and dangerous substances coming through on railroads, what can you tell us about what the legislature's doing there?
Right, so Carolyn McGinn is a hardworking state senator. So if she represents any of you guys, you're lucky. She's a thoughtful person. And she has had an interest in rail legislation for a while. And so that bill, she talked about from personal experiences getting cut off. There's towns that have a hospital on one side and a bunch of the population on the other side of the railroad, and these trains just sit there and nobody goes anywhere. She told a story about, this is in Sedgwick, the town. She said they had a train sitting there, it was 20 degrees outside in the winter, and the kids got out of school and they were walking home, and they just started crawling under the rail cars. And so the idea is to limit these trains' overall length to 1.6 miles. some of the senators during the debate said there's trains going through Kansas 3 to 5 miles long. And that could block a lot of towns, a lot of roads, and then the cars on the side tracks, they have to be parked 125 feet away from a crossing without, this is the bill that still needs to go through the House and the governor, but 125 feet, I think, away from any crossing that doesn't have electronic lights on it, electronic warning. Because she told a story about there's 3 tracks, somebody waiting to get across. Here's a train not moving. There's a blank track. Here's a train not moving. Somebody started across and was immediately killed by the train rocketing through the intersection in the middle lane, in the middle track. So all these trains, they can't be bunched up against the crossing. They got to get down here a ways so people can actually see better. So I think it's common sense legislation that is certainly going to pass. The governor will sign it. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if that just speeds right through the process. So I think it had a
Like
broad,
the trains
support.
don't.
Broad support, and I think Senator McGinn indicated that there's more coming. That this is the first piece of, she didn't articulate it, but several pieces of legislation to try to address rail traffic in Kansas, which is a real important way of moving materials around.
So another kind of hot button issue around here lately, we've recently had some groups that have done Narcan training, and now we're seeing fentanyl be a major topic of discussion and maybe non-discussion in the legislature. So what's going on with some of those bills?
So the big one is legalizing fentanyl test strips that allow people who have either, would mainly be obviously for illegal drugs, but even if they were prescription drugs obtained illegally, allow folks to test and see if there was fentanyl in them. It was a rare accomplishment on the House side this year because they managed to get 121 to 0 vote in favor of making the fentanyl test strips legal. And then it got over to the Senate and they immediately gutted the bill to make it an anti-vax bill instead, restraining the authority of county health commissioners to issue mandates in a pandemic or something like that. I would say of all of the things that are going on in the legislature right now, like that's the one that seems to have gotten people really upset. Certainly people on the House side and some of the senators too, because there's obviously so much desire to get that piece of legislation through, but they just, tossed it out in favor of an anti-vax thing for Senator Stephan of Hutch.
It's really hard to understand why. I guess the people that vote against that test strip thing just think that people that are addicted to drugs should die. I don't know. The test strips are just this thing to try to see if you can detect fentanyl, which in tiny, tiny, tiny amounts will kill you. And so it's very puzzling, and I think there's Republicans and Democrats that are livid in the Senate about people trying to throw the brake switch on the legislation. So it's one of those things that seems so easy to understand why we might want to pass a law like that. Because right now the fentanyl test strips are like drug paraphernalia, like smoking marijuana out of a pipe or something. That's what the test strips are considered, paraphernalia. So the only idea is to just make them not illegal, the test strips not illegal. So we'll see what happens. I would think that bill could eventually pass. A lot of things happen at the end of the session and people come to their senses a little bit. Sometimes the agenda folks, they're spiking bills so they can circle around and pack, because they know a lot of people want it. Let's package it in a bundled bill with stuff they don't want. So we have these 4 things that a lot of people want, and we're going to throw these 5 pieces of junk in there. And now you have a 9 bill bundle, and people have to swallow the bad with the good. So it's a legislative tactic to move things through the building.
One of the kind of bystanders to this That bill also, in addition to legalizing the fentanyl test strips, would have legalized the test strips for the date rape drug. So a lot of the people who came up to testify on this were from, women's shelters in rural parts of the state, some south of Hutchinson, that Representative Probst brought in. And, because the fentanyl strip bill dies, that part of it dies too.
There was also a provision, I believe, that was creating a panel to look into the drug overdose deaths in the state and ways to address that. And that perhaps met the most vociferous opposition in the Senate, with senators saying, oh, we don't know why you need to have another panel or another government panel looking at this. And again, I think just as Tim says, sometimes there are bills that seem like such no-brainers. It's just remarkable to imagine that people would vote against them or strip them out. But
So along with that, then, do you think that there will be legislation that will allow schools to have things like Narcan and that kind of thing in the buildings?
So I remember a bit of a debate about this. There was a proposal to, so there's some public safety funding from the state. There are grants that school districts can apply through the State Board of Ed to basically reinforce school entrances and those things, to make those places like physically safer for kids. And there was a proposal to let some of the schools districts that wanted to use a portion of that grant money to buy this Narcan stuff, so that if high school kid is overdosing on drugs, they can hit them with Narcan and save their life. And the chair of the House K-12 Budget Committee, Christy Williams, said, no, that's too expensive. No can do. And so that got nowhere.
I mean, the one positive thing about Narcan is within the last day or two, the FDA did announce that it was going to be making it available over the counter. So it may be that that's more accessible for schools in one way or another.
So I want to kind of move back out at a wider view again. How important is it for Kansans to be able to identify the groups or the individuals who are providing support and funding for legislators and different bills and that kind of thing?
So this is something that's very interesting to me, and I have meant to write a gigantic piece about it. I have not yet, but stay tuned. I think it is really important to understand that while you as folks who follow the legislature, and perhaps some of you have signed up for various mailing lists, and you have some understanding of the groups that are working in the policy areas, groups like the ACLU, League of Women Voters, Women for Kansas, Mainstream Coalition. There are, and those are mainly people kind of to the center left, to the far left. But it's important to understand that while there are all of these groups and all of these people have lobbyists, or many of them do, and a lot of them are there are really a very small and select group of institutions that have enormous power in Topeka. And you know that they have enormous power because they don't actually have to be very loud about it most of the time. And these are, by and large, the Kansas Chamber. They are the Kansas Policy Institute, which is funded it's money from Koch, which also funds the Kansas Chamber. It is Kansans for Life, which is largely funded or gets a lot of money from the Catholic Conference in the state. And then, there's those three, and what am I missing, Sherman? Oh, well, that is also true. Yes, the KNEA, the school teachers union. Yeah, that's really the only one that's even quasi to the left that has the kind of funding to really play at that level. But really, a lot of times when you're seeing debates play out at the legislature, and you have various people asking you, contact these legislators, do this, do that, it's really the organizations with the money, the real resources, that really drive so much of that policy conversation. And there's really only a handful of them.
I would just say, if I could wave a magic wand to change one thing, it would be during the election cycles, pay zero attention to the pieces of paper that arrive in your mailbox. Doesn't matter who sent it, who they're supporting, who they're against, pay zero attention to them.
So part of this question is about, what do we think about the legislators and the money? And you're right, the Kansas Chamber in some districts can get somebody elected. They can just flat out get a House member elected in rural Kansas. It's cheap. They can pick the candidate, shape the message, put some mailers out there, and particularly if you have an R after your name, you're in. But you're vetted by the Kansas Chamber, not really by the local people. The money in some of these races doesn't seem great. Some of these Senate elections can be expensive. I remember Vicki Schmidt, who's now our state insurance commissioner, way back when Governor Brownback decided there were too many moderates, Republicans in the Senate, and he went after 7 or 8 of them. And they were very successful in running people out. And Vicki Schmidt beat the Brownback machine, but it cost her $300,000. So the money, that's an extraordinary amount of money for a Senate race, but largely the money, it's just not enough to get people too excited. You know, it's enough to make you, the legislator call that lobbyist or that entity back. Connecting the money to legislation is a little hard. We have a citizen legislature. That is really what it's supposed to be. People are supposed to have occupations outside of Topeka. It's a part-time job. You're supposed to have a career and a livelihood back home. That used to always be the case. You know, you had a Wichita legislator who, was a Coleman executive or something. And so you had people with city council or school board or county government experience or ran big businesses or big ranchers or something. They had a lot of standing and experience. But you now have more and more legislators who, being a legislator is the best job they've ever had. And they treat it as a full-time job. And it's a little troubling that they don't have some of the perspective that those people of the past did. There's conflicts of interest in the legislature, and you're going to have that with a citizen legislature, but there's easy ways to deal with it. One of them is to stand up, grab the microphone in a committee meeting or on the House or Senate floor and declare it. We're voting on hog legislation, and I'm a hog farmer, and I've been doing it for 30 years, and I want you all to know that because I'm going to vote on this hog bill because I really understand the industry. So it's the concealed conflicts of interest that become troubling. And there's a really interesting one in the State House at the moment. Chris Kobach was elected Attorney General, and he hired a state senator, J.R. Clays from Salina, to be on his staff as a communications consultant advisor. Now, he's in the state Senate, and there's all kinds of legal issues, criminal justice issues, budget for the Attorney General's office, school finance cases that the AG might be involved in. And so Senator Clays if he's on the Senate Budget Committee, this stuff comes up, he stands up and he'll leave the room. And he was on the Senate floor the other day, and suddenly there's a bill that had to do with the AG's office. This is this week, and he just vaporized. So I don't know, at one point, you're trying to avoid that conflict of interest by not being there, okay. Everybody understands where he works, but at some point, are the Salina area constituents being undermined? They need a full-throated state senator representing their interests, not ducking out of the room every time something that touches one of the AG's tentacles comes up. So these are the conflicts that we have. I know a decade or so, I took 2 years and accumulated items that I thought were legislators that had conflicts of interest. And we wrote a bunch of stories about slumlords getting involved in housing legislation and what it meant to have a school teacher in the state Senate, and so we tried to write about some of those, and I've thought a lot about this, and I do want to have a citizen legislature, and I think it would be bad if we moved. I think legislators need to be paid more because we get a better cross-section of the community there, not just, I can say this because I'm elderly too, but not just older folks who are rich and don't have to work, or they're the spouse of somebody who's pulling down the money. We can have younger people. We can have plumbers. We can have truck drivers. We can have, these people that drive 300 miles to go to the State House can afford it better to have better housing in Topeka if they had a better wage. And I think it would help the legislature make it more like the folks of Kansas rather than an elite class, which it can be. But I think getting away from the citizen legislature would be a mistake in the end.
I actually crunched some numbers on this. Again, I have not written the column yet. Look forward to it. The average age of a Kansas State Senator is, I believe, around 63. Actually, this is median. And in the House, I believe it's about 60, which is about 15 to 20 years younger than the age of the average Kansan. I think the other thing is, though, it's also important to note that what was that?
You said younger.
Oh, sorry, older. Thank you, Tim. But I do think it's also important to note that the Senate president does his full-time job is as director of a Koch sponsored institute on the Wichita State campus. And you can go and look his salary up at Wichita. I mean, I believe he has some real estate interests as well. But, you know.
I would say too, with the influence in the Republican primaries, especially from, you'd cast one vote that some of these powerful interests don't want, and you're gone. We saw a longtime legislator who was a chairman, well respected, and he disappeared last year. So, I think we see this hanging over a lot of votes, especially this time of year. They know these are going to be scored by these powerful organizations, and the postcards are going to come after them, not just on this issue, but any number of issues they can fabricate to take you out.
Well, the anti-trans sports bill
Right.
that is up again this year. Last year, there were 3 Republicans who voted against it, and 3 of those Republicans are gone. Like they were targeted and they were taken out in the primaries.
So that's actually leads really well into my next question then. So we've got a presidential primary coming up. Is that going to have an impact on primaries in Kansas? Will more turnout mean maybe a more moderate legislature, or is it going to mean something different?
So first of all, the Senate passed a bill the other day that would create spend $4 to $5 million of your dollars on a presidential primary, Republican-Democratic presidential primary in March of 2024. And there were a number of objections to it, but right now we do the caucus system. If you've ever familiar with it or ever gone to anything like that, it's just a bunch of people yelling, and you kind of stand over here in this corner if you're for Bernie Sanders, and you go over there if you're for Donald Trump, and so it's a caucus system. And in 2020, the Republicans didn't do it because Trump was just going to be the nominee, and the Democrats, because of COVID, did it by mail, and turnout was pretty substantial. So the idea is to increase interest in the primary, get some of these candidates to come into our flyover state, and I presume the House would probably concur with that. It just seemed like a hefty price tag for a one-issue election, one-question ballot. And in terms of the next election cycle, creating a more moderate legislature, maybe. I think we have a new leadership in the House. The new House Democratic leader is Vic Miller from Topeka. He's a little bit of a pit bull. And I think they felt like they were marginally close to picking up in the last election cycle 6, 7 more House seats. And so I think the Kansas House wants to nibble away at the Republican leadership, and that's where there's more vulnerabilities for Republicans than in the Senate, which has 40 members versus 125. So it's easier to go work 10 vulnerable House Republican districts than it is to take on a senator, because everybody will be up for election in the next cycle. And so if you're a Democrat governor, you got to get one of these chambers to not have the 2/3 veto override majority. And so the Democrats are targeting the House, and they got to get those numbers down into the low 80s. And then, on a party line veto override, then the governor's safe, no matter what the Senate does.
I do think it may be a little harder for Democrats in a presidential year, depending on who's on the ballot, because as we saw, Donald Trump brings people to the polls who otherwise don't participate in elections. So that's a challenge that they're going to have to figure out. There's a number of election laws being argued in courts that could have an impact as well. Um, I think so much depends on who the parties nominate. I just don't even know if there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm for another Biden-Trump showdown. But I would say that a lot depends too on close congressional races. If the control of the U.S. House is up for grabs, Sharice Davids can bring a lot of people out in Johnson County, and that can help Democrats.
Yeah, we just did redistricting. It happens every 10 years, and it's just a big disaster of legislating. And it was a dozen years ago, 20 years, a dozen years ago, I was in a Jeff King, who was we were sitting in the basement of the Capitol, and he was looking at a map, and he was having the map makers on the redistricting back then move a family that had 7 residents in the House to another Senate district. And I took one look at that and said, I'm never coming to one of these meetings again. Just whenever you get the map done, you just let me know. And I'm not watching this sausage making. It was ridiculous. So the House and Senate Republicans reworked all the maps. They X'd out some Democrats in the House, and a particularly troublesome Republican who kept telling them that the House Republican leadership had lost their mind, so they got rid of her. And they tried in the congressional districts to beat Sharice Davids in Kansas City. So they cut the northern half of Wyandotte County off, stuck that into the 2nd district, Jake LaTurner. Then now Jake LaTurner has too many liberals, so they cranked the 1st district, Garden City, over to come down and swoop down from the north to my house in Lawrence. And so now I'm in the big 1st. And yeah.
Me too.
Finally my ag background is going to come in handy when I put my steer in the backyard. We'll see what the neighbors do. So they tried to beat her, and it was really interesting election. Sharice Davids running against Amanda Atkins, who she had run against 2 years before and defeated. Amanda Atkins was a Brownback ally, had run one of Sam Brownback's senatorial campaigns, and was well entrenched in Republican politics. And Sharice, with a gerrymandered district, Sharice Davids widened her margin against Amanda Atkins. So I think that that was really fascinating. I just thought they could take her out, and they didn't. They spectacularly failed. So we'll see what happens in the next election, these congressional races. I think, Tracy Mann in the 1st district, he can't be very thrilled to have 30,000 Lawrence no votes. Those 30,000 people in Lawrence are going to vote for a puppy dog and not Tracy Mann. So he can't be thrilled with that, even though his Republican majority is so vast. It could come a day where they get some Northeast Kansas conservative Democrat who's pro-life, loves guns, and wants to go to Congress, and Tracy Mann could find himself in trouble with that kind of mix. So I think you play around with these maps enough, and you try to score this and score that, and they fail on Sharice Davids, they could get some of these other members of Congress in trouble. I think Estes in Wichita is safe in perpetuity. But these other 2 guys, they're looking over their shoulders. It used to be a slam dunk. Now they're looking over their shoulders.
All right, I've got a couple that kind of I've got one that wants to kind of bounce back a little bit back to Medicaid. There have been, the majority of states have passed Medicaid expansion. So it seems like we should be able to do it. So what is it going to take for Kansas to actually do it?
So you have to have different leadership in the House and Senate. It's as simple as that. And to get different leadership in the House and Senate, you have to have members who are willing to vote for different people to be their leaders. I think sometimes, and this is something I've done when I've written columns, sometimes I really don't want to say, oh, all Republicans are doing something bad, because leaders so often are the ones who set the agenda. But on the other hand, who selects the leaders, right? And so there is some responsibility that goes around here, even though there may be many Republicans who are doing great things or who have people's best interests at heart. Ultimately, if you've got Dan Hawkins in the House and Ty Masterson in the Senate, you're not going to get Medicaid expansion voted on, regardless of how much Republican members may say they want to vote for it.
I think there were two disturbing things that we noted last year. One was over half of the people running for the Kansas House did not have an opponent from the other party on the November ballots. The second thing was, with some very few exceptions in closely contested races around the state, Republicans made it a kind of strategy point to not do public forums. In a lot of cases, they didn't even answer the newspaper questionnaires. And so, I think part of the solution is voters have to go to their candidates and say, where do you stand on this? Are you willing to fight for Medicaid expansion for me? You don't have that option if half the races are not contested and a lot of the others, the Republicans not going to answer that question. So, at some point, I think it comes down to this is a choice that voters make.
All right, so I want to wind us down here a little bit. So my first kind of ending type question is, can you describe for us what it is like to be reporting in the State House at the end of the session when it is just these marathon nights in the Capitol?
So there was a day this week, doesn't have to be the end of the session, the Senate ran 30 bills. It's all intentional to overwhelm legislators and, let's not debate this, let's just push this on through. And so at the end of the session, it can be grueling. I was standing on the House floor one day and a guy trotted down there and started a debate about abortion, 3 a.m. I walked out of the Capitol with a Manhattan senator, he's retired now, Senator Wrights, and it was dawn and they had worked all night, and I said, are you gonna be okay on the drive home? And he goes, yeah, I've got 57 minutes to my front door. I mean, I was tired, and I was like, he had to be 25 years older than I was. And went home and found out the next day, Bob Bethel, who was a House member, longstanding House member, he had left earlier than us, and he drove off I-70, I think, with his car on cruise control. I don't know if he had a heart attack or something, or just fell asleep or whatever, and he died. And the House adopted a midnight rule. You can't start working on another bill after midnight, except every time that comes up, they waive the rule. So the Senate doesn't have that prohibition, and these late nights are intentional. You get tired, you just want to go home. You just can't think anymore. And they make people tired, they overwhelm people. This is the leadership. This is the legislative parliamentary tactic, and it works. People just, they're just exhausted, and they don't want to stand up again and complain about something or offer that amendment or, so these are all tactical approaches, bundling, all these things you hate. I think debating legislation in the middle of the night is outrageous and wrong. The COVID did one tremendous thing in terms of our little democracy here in Kansas. Used to be that the only way you knew what was going on in the Capitol is you physically had to go there yourself. No audio streaming, but now we have archived video. You can watch the live stream of any committee and the House and Senate floor. All of those governor's COVID news conferences are streamed. You could, and 50,000 people would watch the governor. So you can do that. You can go back, I can go back, I can be 2 places at once. I can be 3 places at once. I can be there covering this, finish that story, go back to the House that had a debate 2 hours ago I'm interested in, go back through that video, then go back to yesterday's Senate session and get all that, or, oh no, I heard about a thing that happened, a crazy thing that happened in a committee. It's now all on video, and all of you can watch it online. They have links to all of the written testimony that's submitted. The access that people have now, because of COVID, only because of COVID, is tremendous. If you were a guy in way out Western Kansas and you're kind of interested in that, in the ag policy, you couldn't figure out what the House and Senate ag committees are doing. But now you can sit down once a month on a Saturday and flip through the videos and see what was said and done. You can watch your people as they give speeches on the floor, and they can either be brilliant or idiots, you know, but you get to see it. So, you know, I know COVID killed a lot of people, but in the Kansas State House, it did something tremendous. The opposition to that video was intense, and it lasted, as far as I know, for more than a decade. I had to listen to senators say, there's no way you're putting video in here and people are gonna make fun of my bad hair day. I mean, that's what they were concerned about. But that could have been just BS, because what they really didn't want was anybody to know what they were doing. How they did it, what they did, how they voted in committee, you know, that's what they were hiding. And now it's all out there for everybody to see, and I think everyone is better for it.
Yeah, I think it's intentional that they bundle all these things together, marathon days, day after day, week after week, at the end of the session, to influence the way people vote. I think it's also intentional because it's hard for us doing this full time to keep track of a fraction of what they have going on. It's certainly not realistic for average person, your daily lives with other jobs going on, to navigate all of this. You know, none of you want to sit and watch a 7-hour debate about guns and abortion and Medicaid expansion and on and on and on. And so they, you know, this is intentional for the way they can force people to vote the way they want. It's intentional to discourage public participation. It's intentional to discourage us from keeping up with all of it. But we try to tune in as much as we can, and it can be exhausting in these final couple of weeks. Then the session ends, and we get to decide what's important every day. We get to decide what we're going to write about, and they can't stop us. You know, we keep track through these debates. We'll try to write a couple of stories a day, a piece. But we're also making notes about other interesting things that we can come back to and write later. On the drive over here from Topeka, we were going through kind of comparing notes of what we saw in the House and Senate and what we missed and what we can write about tomorrow since they're not in session, what we'll have to tackle when they come back next week to wrap up and beyond. You know, next week, they're in Monday through Thursday. There are all these conference committees where negotiators from both sides, you know, each chamber sends 3 people together and they work out the final deals, which have probably all been worked out in a back room somewhere else anyway. And you know, you'll be 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night or something, you get wind that there's another conference committee forming, and suddenly, last year it was like 27 pieces of legislation got shoved into a tax bill at the last second. 29. Some of them had never had a hearing. Some of them had never actually been entered into legislation. They just materialized at midnight, and you're handing it to people who have just voted on 20 other things in a row and saying, yeah, I know this is about 150 pages, but go ahead and vote anyway. Trust us, it's all good. So, you know, we're trying to keep track of all of that through the end. Clay and I were in Hutchinson last Monday, which feels like an eternity ago. If you saw us there, we were a little bit more lively. We're a little more exhausted now. I wore a full 3-piece suit, not 3-piece, but wore a full suit. I made a point of talking about my Jerry Garcia tie, which I wear to annoy Clay because he hates it. I'd like to thank Randy here for bringing me another tie to alienate Clay with in the future.
And it's already working.
It's already working.
That's great.
So it's hard for you guys to know what's going on. What is the easiest way for us as constituents to know what's coming up? What we should be able to talk to our legislators about before it's actually hitting the floor?
Read the Reflector.
Yes, you can go to our website, sign up for our free daily newsletter.
You know, I would say that, I mean, this is just as citizen advocacy stuff, I don't think it's really, I think you can all have the most personal impact if you educate yourself and get involved in a particular thing, in a particular issue, in a particular cause. I think there is so much stuff that goes on every year that even if you wanted to say that you were on top of it all, it would just be really difficult. Even in the State House, honestly, if you talk to most legislators, they don't know, how, representatives or senators, they're just taking it as it comes. And I mean, they have their own 2 or 3 or 4 things, but most of the time over there, there's probably only a handful of people on any given day who actually know all of what's happening at any given time. So I think, you know, and we've actually seen some remarkable examples of this session. I mean, there have been a group of childhood sexual abuse survivors who essentially camped out in the basement level of the State House, and you would see them every time you would come in the entrance, and they were talking about you know, their experiences. They wanted to extend the statute of limitations, and essentially the first 2 months happened of the session, and you know, there were some bills introduced, but there was no action whatsoever. And then just this last week, the bill was heard in committee. It's passed the Senate, and now it's heading over to the House. And I think the chances are very high that that's gonna actually make its way into law. But you know, it's because, I mean, those ladies were laser focused on this one thing.
It's a good point. I mean, I think they were bewildered at times just trying to understand why is this not getting a hearing? What do we have to do to get a hearing? They were talking to legislators day after day, week after week, month after month, trying to figure out how to move this legislation forward. And then, you know, finally get a hearing, and then it's, well, what happens next? You know, and there were a lot of negotiations and compromise to get a different bill entirely that everybody could agree on behind the scenes before they could get a hearing on that. And then, you know, now we have a debate in the Senate, and it actually passed, but is the House going to take it up? We don't know. You know, they're still waiting on pins and needles to see if this thing is going to pass. So I think Clay's advice is good. Maybe at the start of next session, pick a single bill that you're interested in, and just keep an eye on how that goes through, and when it suddenly shows up in a different bill, and then that number changes, and then it gets bundled together, and you know, what people are actually saying about this issue when it's being debated. I think that's a good way to figuring out how things really work.
All right, so I know you guys have a sign up over there on the corner of the stage for your newsletter. And you guys are at kansasreflector.com. Is there other stuff that we should follow or look for to be able to make sure we're keeping up with you?
What's our TikTok handle?
KS Reflector.
KS Reflector, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. You can reach out to us directly, and we're always happy to hear from you.
info@kansasreflector.com if you want to send us email.
Yeah, we're easy people to get a hold of, and some of the best stories I've written over the last 35 years came from a phone call from somebody saying, hey, did you hear about this? So don't hesitate to call. We always like good story ideas.
Never assume that someone else has told us about something. Never.
It's true locally as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for us as well. So Harvey County Now, you can go to harveycountynow.com. We do have a weekly newsletter. So if you just want to kind of get an aggregate of a bunch of the different headlines, or if you're not sure if you want to subscribe yet and you just want to kind of check it out, it's a free newsletter. There's a QR code sitting over there on that corner too if you want to scan it, or just go to harveycountynow.com and you can subscribe. And another big initiative that we started this year is what we are calling Press Club. And it's really just a way for people who want to help support local journalism with a few more dollars than their subscription gives us to be able to do that. It's not only functioning as a way to kind of get together and be social and hang out with different people, but it also is sponsoring things like this. And we're hoping to do other events like that. So if this is the type of thing you would like to see in your community and you want to join Press Club by supporting Harvey County Now a little bit more, you can also find that on our website, or I also have some handout cards over on the corner as well. I want to say a huge thank you to the Reflector for coming and driving all this way to see us.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to say a huge thank you again to our friends at Harvey County Now for organizing this, for having the interest in doing this, inviting us down. We're trying to fill this gap in state coverage, but you know, local journalism is incredibly important to these communities. These guys are doing as good a job of it as anybody in the state of Kansas right now.
And thank you also to Bethel for co-sponsoring this with us. They were incredibly just enthusiastic about doing this with us, which we really appreciated as well. Have a fantastic night. Thank you so much for coming.